I never imagined that my quiet, ordinary suburban life would lead me down a path of gnome-fueled rebellion. But here I am, a homeowner who dared to let a little whimsy bloom into full-scale defiance against an overbearing homeowners association. It all began on a breezy Saturday morning, when the soft chirping of birds and the gentle glow of dawn painted a picture of a typical day in my perfectly manicured neighborhood. As I sipped my coffee and scrolled through my phone, a quirky idea caught my eye. Why not add a couple of charming garden gnomes to brighten up my yard? It was meant to be a small, harmless touch, a splash of color to break the monotony of uniform lawns and strict rules. With a smile, I unboxed 2 gnomes, which I promptly named Gary and Linda, and carefully placed them near my flower bed. Their plastic smiles, frozen in time, seemed to promise a world of mischief and delight. Neighbors passing by offered nods of approval and quiet compliments, and for a while, it felt as if nothing could go wrong. Then, a few days later, I found an envelope on my doorstep that changed everything. The envelope, crisp and imposing, bore the official seal of the HOA. Inside, a letter warned me that my unauthorized decorative elements were in violation of the community standards and demanded immediate removal. I stared at the letter in disbelief. How could 2 harmless gnomes be deemed a problem? Rather than caving in to the absurdity of the demand, I decided to respond in kind. I placed Gary and Linda on display with an air of defiance, and, as if to say challenge accepted, I added 5 more gnomes to my collection. With each additional gnome, I felt a surge of rebellious joy. Every new arrival was a silent, plastic declaration of my refusal to conform. Soon enough, my front yard began to transform. What started as a couple of gnomes blossomed into a growing army, each new figure a tiny sentinel against a tide of conformity. Every time I received another warning letter from the HOA, I answered by adding 5 more gnomes. Within weeks, my once pristine lawn had turned into a battleground of quirky defiance, a veritable gnome army that seemed to mock the very notion of unauthorized decor. It wasn't long before the HOA decided to take matters into their own hands. Enter Gordon, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, and the HOA president. With his clipboard in hand and a measuring tape hanging around his neck like a badge of duty, Gordon became a regular visitor to my yard. I still remember the day he first arrived, his face set in a stern expression as he inspected my gnome display. "Sir," he barked, his voice laced with authority, "these unauthorized magical figures are in clear violation of our community guidelines. They must be removed immediately." I couldn't help but smile at his choice of words. "Unauthorized magical figures?" I echoed lightly. "They're just bringing a little joy to the neighborhood, Gordon." My words hung in the air, and for a moment I thought he might laugh. But instead, his expression hardened, and his visits became more frequent, his warnings more pointed, as if he were determined to restore order to our little corner of suburban life. With each warning, my resolve only grew stronger. I began to view every letter, every stern knock on my door, as a challenge, a call to arms in a battle for creative freedom. My yard, once a simple patch of grass, was slowly transforming into a monument of resistance. I started building elaborate displays that turned my garden into something more than just a protest. It was becoming a work of art. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the lawn, I unveiled my secret project, a mini roller coaster designed specifically for the gnomes. I crafted tiny loops and gentle curves, constructing a miniature ride that allowed my gnome soldiers to experience a thrill, even if only in a symbolic way. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched them perched on tiny carts, ready to embark on their little adventure. Neighbors began to gather, some peeking from behind curtains and others daring enough to step outside, all witnessing a spectacle that was as absurd as it was delightful. The transformation of my yard did not go unnoticed. What had begun as a private act of rebellion quickly became a community sensation. Children started coming by on weekends, their laughter blending with the soft hum of enchanted forest music that I had set up on an old speaker system. The Gnome roller coaster became the centerpiece of what people began to call GnomeLandia. I even set up a little ticket booth just for fun, And before long, the media caught wind of the unfolding drama. Local news vans parked by the curb and reporters interviewed me about my gnome uprising, as it was being dubbed. Every new development added another layer to the story, a tale of how a simple act of creative expression had snowballed into something much larger than I ever anticipated. As the gnome population in my yard swelled into the hundreds, so did the intensity of the conflict with the HOA. One particularly memorable day, Gordon arrived with an air of urgency that surpassed his usual routine. His face was red with anger as he marched up to my door, clipboard clutched tightly. "These gnomes are a threat to our community standards," he thundered in front of a small, gathered crowd of skeptical neighbors. The tension in the air was palpable. I could see a mixture of admiration and concern on the faces of onlookers. In that moment, I realized that this was no longer just about a couple of garden ornaments. It was about challenging a system that valued uniformity over creativity. Without hesitation, I stepped forward and produced a thick stack of petition papers, each one signed by a neighbor who believed in our cause. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pulsing through my veins, "this petition represents every single one of us who refuses to let our community be defined by outdated rules. We demand that our neighborhood celebrates art, expression, and yes, even garden gnomes." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted into murmurs of agreement and applause. Even old Mr. Jenkins, known for his gruff demeanor and reluctance to engage in anything remotely playful, gave a hesitant thumbs up. In that moment, it wasn't just about the gnomes. It was about reclaiming our right to make our surroundings our own. The vote at the emergency HOA meeting was swift and decisive. Amid the heated debate, the community's unified stand against the stifling regulations became undeniable. Gordon's authority, once unchallenged, crumbled in the face of collective will. As he stepped down from his self-appointed role, there was a strange mix of relief and triumph that washed over the room. I approached him, extending my hand in a gesture that was both conciliatory and victorious. "Sometimes even the strictest enforcer can't resist a little bit of magic," I remarked, and for a moment, the tension gave way to an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps there was a time for rules, and a time for embracing the unexpected. In a twist of irony that none of us could have foreseen, Gordon eventually found himself playing an entirely new role in our transformed neighborhood. No longer the relentless taskmaster, he became an unlikely ambassador for GnomeLandia, even donning a tour guide vest as he led visitors around the park he once sought to suppress. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, my front yard, now affectionately known as GnomeLandia, evolved into a local landmark. The park wasn't just a protest against the HOA. It had become a vibrant celebration of community, creativity, and the defiant joy of nonconformity. Families gathered on weekends, children's laughter filled the air, and local business flourished as curious tourists from neighboring towns stopped by to witness the spectacle. I began offering guided tours, sharing the story of how a simple act of rebellion had grown into a community movement that redefined what it meant to belong. Every gnome in the park, whether perched on a miniature roller coaster, standing guard near a tiny castle built from popsicle sticks, or simply resting by a glowing fairy light display, was a testament to the power of imaginative defiance. Neighbors who had once feared the repercussions of bending the rules now embraced a newfound spirit of unity and joy. Late at night, when the world around me had quieted down, I would often step outside and reflect on the unlikely journey that had brought me here. Sitting on my porch under a sky dotted with stars, I marveled at the sight of GnomeLandia lit up by hundreds of twinkling lights. The gentle hum of conversation and the soft strains of enchanted forest music served as a reminder that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a movement that had touched every corner of our community. I thought back to the day I first unboxed Gary and Linda and marveled at how two small, unassuming figures had sparked a revolution. Every gnome, every tiny detail of the park, symbolized the belief that creativity and individuality could flourish even in the face of rigid conformity. The transformation wasn't merely physical. It was deeply emotional and profoundly unifying. In challenging the status quo, I had inadvertently brought my neighbors together, forging bonds that transcended the mundane rules of suburban life. There were moments of doubt along the way, times when I wondered if the rebellion was worth the growing conflict, if a few dozen gnomes could really stand against the might of the HOA. But every time I saw a neighbor smile, every burst of laughter from a child riding the gnome roller coaster, I knew that our little act of defiance was making a difference. It wasn't about vandalizing property or inciting chaos. It was about reclaiming our right to express ourselves, to celebrate the beauty of the unexpected, and to create a space where everyone felt they belonged. I remember one chilly autumn evening when, in the dead of night, I gathered with a small group of friends and even some of the neighborhood kids to install new additions to our ever-growing gnome collection. Under the soft glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of crickets, we meticulously placed each gnome with care and precision, sharing whispered jokes and dreams of a future where creativity reigns supreme. "Do you think Gordon will ever sleep knowing what we're up to?" one of the kids asked, his eyes wide with excitement. I smiled, adjusting a gnome on a tiny seesaw, and replied, "Let him worry. Tonight, we build our legacy." It was in these quiet conspiratorial moments that I realized the true power of our collective rebellion. It wasn't just about defying an unjust rule, but about igniting a spark in every person who dared to dream of a more colorful, expressive world. The turning point, however, came during an emergency HOA meeting that I never thought I'd witness. The community center was packed with anxious residents, all gathered to discuss the escalating issue of my unauthorized garden decorations. Gordon, red-faced and determined, stood before us and declared that the gnomes were a threat to our community's very fabric. The tension in the room was thick, and I could feel the weight of every disappointed look and frown. Summoning all the courage I had, I stepped forward and presented a petition signed by every resident on our block, a bold statement that we would no longer be governed by outdated rules that stifled our spirit. "We demand that our community celebrates creativity and individuality," I declared, my voice echoing through the silent room. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Applause erupted, and even the most skeptical neighbors found themselves nodding in agreement. In that charged moment, it became clear that the true victory lay not in the removal of the gnomes, but in the solidarity and unity of a community that had finally found its voice. In the months that followed, GnomeLandia grew beyond my wildest dreams. What started as a personal protest evolved into an annual festival, a vibrant, whimsical celebration of everything we stood for. The Festival of Gnomes attracted families, tourists, and even local businesses that benefited from the influx of visitors. Stalls selling quirky crafts, food vendors offering themed treats, and interactive workshops where people could create their own miniature gnome figures became the norm. The park was alive with color, music, and laughter, and it served as a living reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the most extraordinary transformations. Even Gordon, once the staunchest enforcer of rigid rules, had embraced his new role as a tour guide in our very own gnome wonderland. Clad in a vest and armed with a newfound sense of humor, he would lead groups around the park, pointing out quirky features and sharing the story of how our neighborhood had come together to defy the odds. "Over here," he would say with a wry smile, "you'll see our gnome of reconciliation, a tribute to the community spirit that brought us all together." His transformation was nothing short of remarkable, and it symbolized the profound shift in attitudes that had swept through our once staid neighborhood. Now, as I stand at the entrance of GnomeLandia and gaze upon the vibrant tapestry of life that it has become, I am filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. The journey that began with two humble gnomes has blossomed into a full-blown movement, a testament to the power of creative rebellion and the unyielding strength of community. I often reflect on those early days, when I first dared to challenge the status quo, and marvel at how a single, seemingly insignificant act could ripple outwards to inspire so many. Every gnome in the park, every twinkling light strung up in the evening, and every shared smile between neighbors is a reminder that beauty and joy can flourish even in the most unlikely of places. At times, I find myself lost in thought, revisiting the quiet moments when I sat alone on my porch, contemplating the cost of defiance and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But those moments of solitude were always short-lived, replaced by the jubilant chorus of community celebrations and the infectious energy of those who believed in our cause. I remember one particularly crisp winter night when the entire neighborhood gathered for an impromptu bonfire. The flames danced against the cold night air, and as we huddled together, sharing stories and laughter, it became clear that we had forged something far more enduring than a mere protest. We had built a legacy of resilience, creativity, and the unbreakable bonds of a community united by a common dream. Looking back, I realized that the true magic of GnomeLandia lies not in the gnomes themselves, but in the spirit they represent. They are symbols of rebellion against a world that too often values conformity over individuality. They remind us that even in the face of relentless bureaucracy and inflexible rules, there is always room for a little mischief, a bit of color, and a lot of heart. And so, as I continue to watch families, friends, and even former adversaries come together in this quirky sanctuary, I am reminded that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can lead to the most profound transformations. I invite you to remember this. Never underestimate the power of a simple idea to change your world. Whether it's a garden gnome or a groundbreaking innovation, every bold step taken in the name of creativity has the potential to ignite a revolution. And in our little corner of the world, that revolution has been nothing short of magical. So, if you ever find yourself feeling stifled by the expectations of others or constrained by rules that seem to dampen your spirit, think of Gary, Linda, and all the brave gnomes that stood their ground in my yard. Let their silent protest remind you that there is beauty in daring to be different, and that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest acts of rebellion. Embrace your inner mischief, gather your community, and create your own space for joy. For in the end, it is our shared moments of wonder and defiance that make life truly magical. And as I step forward into each new day with a vibrant legacy of GnomeLandia behind me, I can't help but smile at the thought that our little gnome uprising has forever changed the landscape of our lives, proving that even in the strictest of neighborhoods, a spark of creativity can light up the world. Thanks for watching. Share with friends, subscribe, and like.